So here I am today with Nathaniel Philbrick, who's just released Valiant Ambition, your latest and I think greatest work that you've done so far. You came here 2 years ago now, and as I understand it, this is where it all kind of got started, and how appropriate when we're talking about Benedict Arnold and the American Revolution. What's it like to come back now to the Maritime Museum?
Well, it's kind of nostalgic. I mean, you have to realize it really did begin with you guys here. I mean, my wife Melissa and I said we've got to begin on Lake Champlain, because this Benedict Arnold is really the focus of this, and it's going to start with the Battle of Valcour Island, and there's no better place to go than the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. So we contacted you and showed up, and you were nice enough to talk to me. You pulled out a couple of charts of Lake Champlain, because I was, in my innocence, was going to, just head up the lake for Valcour. And so I could tell you're going, okay, let's see. So what we went through, and it was really helpful. And the next day, Melissa and I just headed up the lake. And so it really did begin here. You've got the replica of the gondola, which is just, for me, it's so important to go to the places and to see something like that. Just makes it so much more real and immediate. So yeah, it all began here.
But you're no stranger to Lake Champlain, is that right?
Yeah. No, back when my teenage years, we had a camp up in Underhill, and I was getting very impatient with all the trees. I really love sailing. And so my parents indulged us, and we had a couple of boats at Fisher's Landing and in Shalott, and I eventually became a counselor at a sailing day camp there. And so sailing on Lake Champlain is what I grew up with. I raced my sunfish in Mallett's Bay at the annual regatta there every year throughout my teenage years. I just love it here. So for me, that's what was really exciting, because coming here was revisiting the places of my youth, and then to discover this place really brought it all together.
You're a stellar historian, and historians and archaeologists are so much akin. We're both doing the same thing.
Yeah.
We're out there exploring archives, exploring remains underwater, using that information to get a clearer picture of what history is all about. And I know as an archaeologist, I have aha moments, like these moments of discovery where something very new and very exciting. In this book, did you have any of those aha moments while you were doing your research?
Over and over again. And it really began on Lake Champlain, because once you get up to Valcour, you go, aha, so this is what he was up to. You just see the geography, the topography, the bay there, and knowing that the British were only going to come down in a northerly, let them go by the island, come get me, come against the wind. It all clicked into place there. And I grew up as a competitive sunfish racer and on other classes, and so going upwind, the tactics were a big part of what I grew up with. But to see how Arnold visualized the battle to come, and how he really set up the circumstances of it, I really couldn't appreciate until I was there. And also to have the underwater archaeology that you guys have done really helped to put into place, where everybody was situated and how it unfolded there in October of '76.
Yeah. Benedict Arnold.
Yeah.
Obviously one of the most controversial characters in American history. We get to tell the story of his bravado, bravery, genius in his tactics, because we're focused on 1775 to 77. Yet we all know he goes down the dark path, and as we study him, it's easy for us as historians to justify his actions. Yeah. And yet, and the indignities in which he suffered, it's easy to understand perhaps why he did. But ultimately, in the final picture, when you look at Benedict Arnold and what he did, was he justified in his actions, in turning sides?
Well, it's interesting, and that's really why I was so excited about doing this book, the mystery of Arnold, because, as you said, between 75 and 77, he's our best general, bar none. while Washington is suffering setback after setback, Arnold's the one really keeping us in the war. But you know, I think you can see the seeds for where he will go. I mean, you know, a lot of his daring do helped feed his reputation. It also won him justifiable accolades. But you know, to a certain extent, it was all about Arnold in the beginning, to a certain extent. And then he did suffer indignities from the Continental Congress and all this, and you can see why someone of his temperament, which was fiery, you know, the only mode he knew was all-out attack, which meant that when he was in the midst of battle, he was butting heads often with other officers, with politicians, so controversy was following him. But he had such skills that someone like George Washington had the ultimate respect for him. But yes, but he ultimately turned. And so, you know, what I was trying to do with my book, Valiant Ambition, was what happened there. And I think it really kicks in after the Battle of Saratoga, where he's so grievously injured in the left leg. This is a man whose physicality is absolutely essential to who he was. He was a real athlete, incredible endurance, and he's forced to be bedridden for 4 months, his leg in a fracture box. The leg will emerge 2 inches shorter, and he broods, and it's just not good for him. And he comes out a different guy, and he then gets embroiled in the tumultuous political situation in Philadelphia, meets Peggy Shippen, half his age. You know, he's a widower with 3 kids. He's not being treated well by his own government, by the Pennsylvania government, and she comes from a loyalist background, and a month after their wedding, he makes his first overtures to the British. And so I think it's a complex guy. He really, he was angry with his own country and feeling that so much of the fervor with which the war had begun had been lost. The American people were much more interested in fighting themselves than the British. The Continental Congress was helpless in raising the money that we needed to fight this revolution. And then there was the personal side, where he feels hurt. He's married to a woman who's saying, hey, come on, you know, the British have much more respect for you than your own country. He's broke, and he liked to live above his means. He really had aristocratic pretensions. He would have loved to have been, you know, had that mansion on the hill, and Peggy came from that background. And so an aristocratic British officer was just the kind of thing, in one sense, he aspired to have. And so, you know, I think you can understand it, whether it's justifiable. Hey, we live in a republic, and protest is part of what we do. But at some point, protest undermines the underpinnings of government, and that becomes treason. And Arnold went there, and he did it for the money, ultimately. And so it's reprehensible, and it's sad, and it's tragic. And the real tragic thing is what he did here on Lake Champlain is underappreciated because of what he did. You know, we think of him as this caricature villain when he was much more complex, and it should not detract from the accomplishments he was responsible for at the beginning of the revolution.
I dare say if he had died at Saratoga, he'd be on one of our bills at this point.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And you know, and that is the true irony of Arnold. You know, he was a great American hero through Saratoga. If he had died then, he would have, you know, there'd be statues for him all over. There'd be Arnoldsvilles all over America. But it was as a traitor that he really galvanized this country, because people were shocked that someone of his stature could go the other way. It was inconceivable. He was burned in effigy up and down the eastern seaboard. And so, you know, it's as a traitor that he, in a way, contributed the most to the American cause, because it was a wake-up call to the American people. Within a year is the victory at Yorktown that ultimately wins the War of Independence for us. And so he's a fascinating figure, and he's one I think we can take pride in, and yet, you know, he was a traitor. And so it's, for me, that's exactly the kind of moral conundrum that I find fascinating. And to come here to Lake Champlain when he was that hero is so refreshing and sad all at the same time.
Yeah. So today in our education system, I think a point could be made that the emphasis tends to steer towards science, technology, engineering, math, those sorts of things. And there may be a de-emphasis on the history component and the humanities component. Not entirely, but perhaps some.
No, yeah.
As a historian yourself, how does this make you feel, and why, and I'm going to have to assume you'd like to see more humanities brought into education. Why is that so important for our youth to understand this history and characters like Benedict Arnold and George Washington and Peggy Shippett?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important when it comes to the history education that young people get, is that it is character-based to a certain extent, that it's about the people. Because so often it's about the broader strokes, dates, events that are hard for people to emotionally connect with. And if you do not emotionally connect with your material when it comes to the humanities, it doesn't have an impact on a young person. I know for me, the past doesn't become real and relevant unless I have an emotional connection with the people involved. And for me, I come from a journalistic background. And for me, writing about the past is trying to create a journalistic sense of life as lived back then. And to do that, I focus on the people, I tell the stories of the past. And the past is full of fascinating stories. And they are just so much more interesting and surprising than the shorthanded mythology that many of us have grown up with. And so I think it's absolutely essential for young people to get history, not just the broad stroke, but to get at who these people were as best as we can determine. Because, you know, you end up living a life and you're responding to people. You know, yes, there are big things happening, but ultimately our world is defined by those with whom we interact with. And for me, history is about identifying those kinds of circumstances in the past. And I think it's absolutely vital for an education about America to have that. And for me, it's something like the great success of Hamilton on Broadway achieves exactly that. It humanizes the history. It brings those characters to life in a way that is relatable to kids in the 21st century, that it doesn't dumb it down in the least. It gets at the complex, very specific circumstances of that time, but in a way that we can relate to from where we are now. And if we can't do that emotional connection, it ultimately, I think, fails to have a true audience in young people. So I think history is absolutely vital.
And you do that so well. You make the connections with the stories and the people, unlike so many authors out there. It's just fabulous to read your work. And that's, I think, too, why at the Maritime Museum we've built things like full-scale replicas of gunboats.
Yeah.
Because it is beyond the dates and the names and the broad brush of perhaps books or the internet. It's that tangible link, and to talk about 45 people living in a space of that size, that really starts to bring it home. And when they learn about where they ate, where they were going to the bathroom.
Exactly. Well, it was a discussion with you. I mean, I remember walking down to look at the replica, and you 40 people, and you begin to go, wow. And it's late September, early October on Northern Lake Champlain, and you begin to realize that just the inherent suffering involved in all this, and how terrified they were knowing this huge British invasionary force is headed their way. It humanizes it. And so at a place like this, you can see how things were built. You can see you're at the lake, so you have that visual background. But models like this, for me, you can look at all the pictures and archival images on a computer screen, but it's not until you're here and have the context and the chance to examine things from all different directions that it really, for me at least, it doesn't become real until then.
All right. Well, I got a school group down on the gunboat right now. You want to go take a look?
Oh, we'd absolutely love to.
All right.